Okay, we're going to start maybe around 8:01, 8:02 just to get the last few strugglers. And at the end, I think we'll have between 25 and 30 people for this webinar.
Okay.
So. Okay, so what's going to happen is Peter is going to begin in about a minute or two, and he will open up the webinar. Oh, Peter, I didn't send you the opening remarks.
No, it's fine.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
Hold on.
So where are you guys speaking from? I saw from one of you was from Baltimore. Is that right?
Irina's in Maryland, I think, at American U,
Maryland.
and I'm in Virginia.
Right. Okay.
We both work out of DC, though. And we've got a couple of attendees in England right now, it looks like.
Ah.
Okay, Peter, I sent you the opening remarks, so you should have them right about now.
Yep, I just got them. I was just going to improvise. I've done this a lot, so.
Yeah, this time I sort of like cut out all of the stuff about SFL and I just jumped right in. And I'm just gonna, I thought I would mention this as part of our Bastiat project.
Awesome, awesome.
And mention that they still have time to submit work by November 15th and maybe win $1,000, so.
Awesome, awesome.
Does that include me? Can I win $1,000?
No, unfortunately, because I think you know too much about Frederic Bastiat.
I've been working so hard on him. I've been channeling him the last couple of weeks.
But
Okay,
Dr. Hart,
let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to mute myself, and the screen is on you, Dr. Hart, so when he's done, you're all set to go.
Okay.
I do want to apologize, Dr. Hart,
Okay.
for when I
All right.
mispronounced your schools that you've gone to.
That's all right. I didn't like them.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Students for Liberty's e-leadership series. My name is Peter Niger, and I'm the Internal Operation Manager for Students for Liberty. We are honored today to have Dr. David Hart deliver a talk on the life and works of Frederic Bastiat. Now, our talk tonight is a special edition in our ongoing Bastiat project. You still have time to win up to $1,000 to write an essay relating to the central theme of one of Bastiat's essays to the current public policy issue. You can still register and submit your work by November 15th, so you got a couple of weeks. Be sure to check out all the details on our website, studentsforliberty.org, and watch out for more information in the follow-up email. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening. David Hart was born and raised in Sydney, Australia. He did his undergraduate work at Macquarie University in Sydney, writing a thesis on the radical anti-statist thought of the Belgian-French political economist Gustave de Molinari. After spending a year in Germany studying German imperialism and the origins of the First World War at the University of Mainz, he completed an MA in history at Stanford University. Now, while at Stanford, he worked on the student programs for the Institute for Humane Studies, where he was the founding editor of the Human Studies Review. He received a PhD in history from King's College in Cambridge on the work of two leading French classical liberals of the 19th century, Charles Combe, and Charles Dunoyer. I'm sorry, I do not know how to pronounce French words, who pioneered a liberal class theory of history. He then taught for 15 years in the Department of History at the University of Adelaide in South Australia, where he was awarded the University Teaching Prize. Since 2001, he has been the director of the Online Library of Liberty project at Liberty Fund in Indianapolis. The OLL has won several awards, including a Best of the Humanities on the Web award from the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2006. His research interests include history of classic liberal thought, war and culture, and film and art. Without further ado, I present Dr. David Hart.
Hello to you all. I'm speaking from Indianapolis, in Indiana, and I say good morning to those of you who are in England, and I say good midday to those of you who might be in Australia. Please let me know if there are any Aussies online. I'd like to know. You know that I'm in Australia, so that's why I have such a funny accent. I've been in Indiana for 9 years, but I still haven't acquired the local dialect, although my 17-year-old children have, with some felicity. Today I want to talk about Frederic Bastiat, and I have on the screen at the moment my Frederic Bastiat page on my web page, and you'll find here all sorts of interesting information, including a picture of the man, some PDFs of his life and work in the form of a timeline, and some other material that might be of use to you as we go through this lecture. One of my tasks at the Liberty Fund, which is based here in Indianapolis, is to oversee a large translation project of the complete works of Frederic Bastiat. This is going to be in 6 volumes and based upon the 7-volume edition of his complete works, which was published in France in the 1860s. And this is, I think, a very significant publishing event because less than half of his works have been translated into English before. So we have a huge amount of material which will be new to English readers, which I think is very exciting. The first volume of our new series is coming out in March of 2011, and it will include a volume of over 200 of his letters to his family and friends, as well as his colleagues in Paris, and will include some of his essays and statements that he wrote when he stood for election, which is very, very apropos given the fact that in the United States tomorrow we're having a major midterm election. In honour of Bastiat, I've written a couple of limericks. I like to write limericks, and I spent some time this afternoon composing these ones. And I welcome any of you who have an urge in that direction to write your own limericks and to send them to me. It's actually quite hard to rhyme Bastiat, so if any of you come up with some good rhymes, please let me know. It's also quite difficult to rhyme his birthplace, which was Bayonne in southwest France, and also the town where he spent most of his time, Mougran. But I tried my best with Bastiat, and please, I ask your forgiveness for some of the poor rhymes here. But here's a limerick I wrote today in honour of Frederic Bastiat. There once was an arch anti-statist who thought the state's dangers were greatest, when those whom it bettered fought those whom it fettered with statutes that made them the strongest. And my second one, again, a very hard word to rhyme on, and this is tariffs, because one of the things that Bastiat is famous for is his opposition to all forms of protectionism and tariffs in France in the 1840s. So here it goes. There once was a critic of tariffs who argued restrictions are rip-offs, consumers are plundered, trade rivals are hindered, and commerce in all quarters drops off. I know that's a terrible rhyme, but it's the best I could do. For those of you who are interested in further rhymes and songs, this is one I wrote in honour of the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, and it's called Laissez-faire, and it's written to the tune of the Beatles song Let It Be. But I'll leave that for you to look at in your own time because we have a fair bit to get through tonight. Let me go to my presentation, and I'll take you through not all of it, but some of the main points. And here we have a picture of Bastiat. On the left is a picture of him probably as a statesman. He was elected to the Chamber of Deputies during the revolutionary year of 1848, and he was elected twice, once to the Constituent Assembly which was designed to draw up a new constitution for France after the monarchy was overthrown. And the insignia on his lapel, I think, is significant because it shows that he was a member of the chamber. And then because he was such an important person in 19th century French classical liberal circles, some of his colleagues in the 1870s and 1880s raised money to produce, or to make this statue, this monument to Frederic Bastiat, which was erected in his hometown of Moucron. This is a slide showing you what the title page or the cover of the first volume of the Bastiat complete works will look like. And because I'm so knee-deep in Bastiat material at the moment, I'm the academic editor and I'm writing lots of footnotes and glossary entries. I feel that my office has become a bit of a hard hat area for Bastiat studies and Bastiat work. And I created this little composite image of Bastiat wearing a hard hat. One of the things that's interesting about Bastiat is that he is a sort of transitional figure between a number of economic schools which were developing in the 19th century. The left-hand column of the three thinkers there, the so-called Anglo-Scottish classical school of Adam Smith at the top, David Ricardo in the middle, and John Stuart Mill in the bottom, becomes the dominant school of economic thinking in the first half of the 19th century. Parallel to this was a French school of thought, which is less well known than the English and Scottish classical school. And this is made up of an 18th century writer by the name of Turgot, another figure who is a bit of a transitional figure between the 18th and the 19th century, Jean-Baptiste Say, and then Frederic Bastiat himself, who's at the bottom of the second column. And these figures were the dominant forms, or the dominant writers in the French school in the first half of the 19th century. And they supplemented and built upon the Anglo-Scottish school, but went off in somewhat different directions, which makes them quite interesting for scholars today. For example, those of you who know anything about the Austrian School of Economics and the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, will probably have known that Rothbard and others in the Austrian school highly regard Frederic Bastiat, see him in many ways as a precursor to the Austrian School of Economics, which was to develop much later in the 19th century. The third column is the socialist school in France and Germany, and this was the school which focused a lot of attention by Frederic Bastiat because they were seen as some of the main intellectual opponents of his laissez-faire free market school of economic thinking. The top figure in the third column is Henri de Saint-Simon, who was an early socialist thinker in the 1810s and 1820s. And then during Bastiat's own time of the 1840s, we have Proudhon, who was an anarchist socialist. And Bastiat engaged him in some very significant discussions and debates in the 1840s about the justice of interest and rent and profit. As a socialist and an anarchist, Proudhon opposed profit, interest and rent, seeing them as ways of exploiting the working class, whereas Bastiat said that these were all, or could be and should be, the products of voluntary exchanges and therefore were not exploitation. And then someone who wrote mainly after Bastiat died, Karl Marx, who we see down there, the very bushy beard, Victorian-looking gentleman, who hated and despised everything that Bastiat stood for. And I'll go through some of his amusing criticism of Bastiat in a moment. And then later in the century, we have a new school of thought emerging, which some of you might be familiar with, and this is the so-called marginalists, the people who were writing in the 1870s, like Léon Walras in Switzerland, Jevons in England, and Karl Menger in Austria, who argued that there was an entirely new way of looking at things like prices and value, breaking away from the classical school of Smith, Ricardo, and Mill, and ushering in a new way of thinking about economics, which paved the way for Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and Murray Rothbard in the 20th century. So that's to try to give you an overview of the major economic schools of thought in which Bastiat was involved in or leading up to in the 19th century. Karl Marx is a very interesting character. and I've read far more of Marx than I would like to have. But Bastiat was one of the leading figures of the French free market and free trade school, and because of that, Marx focused in on him as one of the main intellectual enemies of the socialists in the 1840s. In his work Das Kapital, which the first volume of which appeared in 1867, so well after Bastiat died in 1850, Marx calls Bastiat, for example, the most superficial and therefore the most successful representative of apologetic vulgar economics. So he despised Bastiat's support for free trade because he saw the free traders as just being the sort of paid bagmen, which is a word from the second quotation, the paid bagmen of the big capitalists and industrialists of the time. Even though, of course, for Bastiat, they were some of the main intellectual enemies of the free trade movement. The industrialists in France, in many cases, demanded tariff protection and subsidies from the French government, which Bastiat opposed. Marx also went on to call Bastiat a dwarf economist. And you can find all these very amusing and nasty remarks in Marx's footnotes in Das Kapital if you have an interest in following it. So Bastiat is seen as the great enemy of socialists like Karl Marx. Bastiat also had his followers and supporters. He was extremely popular in the 19th century. His works remained in print throughout most of the 19th century, right up until the First World War, when intellectual climate changed so much that the classical liberal tradition was largely eclipsed until its rediscovery after the Second World War. And here we see four characters who talked about how important Bastiat was to their intellectual development. And one of the key figures in this is Leonard Read, who helped begin the Foundation for Economic Education after the Second World War. He was active in various chambers of commerce in Southern California and came across the works of Bastiat and began to read and discover that Bastiat was a very significant thinker and popularizer of free market ideas 100 years previously. And Leonard Read was instrumental in having some of his works republished and circulated in America in the 1940s and 50s. He then, the Fee went on to commission further translations, which is the most commonly used ones today, the Fee translations of Economic Harmonies and Economic Sophisms, and a third volume, a selection of his essays in political economy. Another very important figure who was an admirer of Bastiat was the economic journalist who wrote for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, Henry Hazlitt. And Henry Hazlitt wrote a book called Economics in One Lesson and dedicated it to Bastiat and said that Bastiat was in fact the inspiration for the writing of this book. That Bastiat's skill as an economic journalist and his wit and his savage criticism of what he called economic fallacies or economic sophisms, that is, the mistakes that people commonly had about the operations of the free market, was an inspiration for Henry Hazlitt and his writings. And Henry Hazlitt went on to develop a following of free market supporters in the post-war period, which is very significant. Murray Rothbard, of course, is a very important figure in the modern Austrian economic school, and he saw Bastiat as one of the great precursors of the Austrian school, and wrote about him very positively in his History of Economic Thought. Now, a fourth person you may not think about as being a great supporter of Bastiat or even interested in his ideas was President Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan has surprised many people when they published his essays and speeches. Puzzled for the first reason that he wrote many of them himself, when the custom now is, of course, that you employ professional speech writers. But the second thing is that not only did he write his own speeches, but he also read quite widely and had read Frederic Bastiat's writings, possibly the editions published and put out by Leonard Read in the Foundation for Economic Education, and was deeply moved by some of Frederic Bastiat's criticisms of socialism and of economic planning and in favour and support of free trade. So here are four individuals, I think, who are significant in the late 20th century, who owed many of their ideas to the work of Frederic Bastiat. Now when we talk about Bastiat, it's often not known where he came from. I mean, people in America and Australia and Britain perhaps don't know this region of southwest France where he originated. But if you look on the second illustration on the right, you'll see in the left-hand side, down the bottom of the Bay of Biscay, the town of Bayonne. And this is where Bastiat was born. And it's quite significant because for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a trading town on the coast. It's on a river, the Adour River. And the Adour River was the main transportation route for wine producers in this part of southwest France. Further north, you have Bordeaux, which is, of course, extremely well known as a wine-producing region. And Bayonne was part of the feeder satellite cities that contributed to the Bordeaux wine industry. So Bastiat grows up. Oh, the second thing is, of course, it's close to the Spanish border. And when you have a period of economic regulation and tariff restrictions on trade, it's the towns that are on the coast, on rivers, and close to international borders where you have smuggling that goes on. People trying to get around the onerous restrictions imposed upon them by the state and to engage in mutually beneficial trade. So this is the region where Bastiat grows up. He eventually buys a small estate, a small farm, in the town of Mugron. You can see that. That's the red dot, or the red object with the black dot in it. And that's where he has his estate and where he spends about 20 years of his life reading and studying in a small provincial town of Mugron. And of course, the picture on the bottom left-hand corner is a modern Google map showing you the still very small scale of the town of Mugron, where Bastiat was born. Here's a contemporary map of that département showing the borders and trade routes and rivers, which might be of interest to some of you. Here's another picture of Mugron showing the river going through to Bayonne. If you're interested in looking at, in more detail, the life and work of Frederic Bastiat, I've prepared these two timelines. There's the first part of his life called the Unseen, and then the second one is called the Seen Bastiat. Now this is a play on words from the title of one of his best-known essays called The Seen and the Unseen. And one of the things that Bastiat does in this essay is to argue that everybody can see the effects, the superficial effects of economic activity. These are obviously the seen. So for example, if there is a severe economic downturn, we see unemployed people. This is the seen. Now what is not seen so readily are all the consequences of the actions that this unemployment might cause. This is what he calls the unseen. And he says the true economist is not only aware of what is obviously seen at first glance, but is also able to see the more deep and the more complex consequences of various economic actions. So for example, the unemployed may cry out for government support, government subsidies, because they are unemployed. This is obviously seen and is obviously a major justification for economic or government activity intervention in the marketplace. Bastiat says, well, what happens when the government introduces some subsidy program to help the unemployed? What we don't see is the consequences of the increased taxation which is required to provide these subsidies for the unemployed. Someone who is employed, for example, is more heavily taxed. They can no longer buy that new pair of shoes for their daughter. They have to pay extra taxes to the government. The deprivation of the reduction in their income and the inability to buy these second pairs of shoes means that the shoe industry suffers. That someone who might have been able to sell a pair of shoes is no longer able to sell a pair of shoes. So there is an economic recession in the shoe industry. And so this percolates through the economy. So for every government action which might appear on the surface to solve a problem, actually causes a whole concatenation of effects which are unseen at the first glance, but which are very significant and which needs examination. And this was one of Bastiat's most famous essays. And so what I did was I took his use of the term seen and unseen to divide his own life into two periods. He spent the first half of his life as a virtual unknown in a small town in southwest of France called Mougron. He was elected or appointed a minor official. He was a justice of the peace. He served on various government committees and was a minor and inconsequential government official. But what he did in those years between 1801 and 1844 was he engaged in all sorts of other activities which were to bear fruit in the mid-1840s. For example, he joined all sorts of discussion groups. He was very active in local community affairs, and they would discuss and meet to discuss newspapers, new books, all sorts of intellectual activity. And for 20-odd years, Bastiat read everything. He read everything to do with economics. He was fluent in 3 or 4 languages. He spoke French, of course. He spoke English. He spoke Italian. He spoke Spanish. He had some business interests in Spain, which took him across the border on a number of occasions. But he was fascinated by economics. So he read Adam Smith, Jean-Baptiste Say, Malthus on population. He read Charles Comte and Dunoyer. He read everything. And he did so in the quiet of this provincial backwater. And this is the unseen Bastiat, the man developing thoughts and ideas and discussing them with his friends in the small community around Mougron. One of the things he comes across in the early 1840s is some newspaper articles denouncing the British Free Trade Movement. Now, the British Free Trade Movement was being organised by Richard Cobden, who was a businessman from Manchester. And Cobden began one of the most successful free trade movements of a popular kind in the entire history of mankind. And Bastiat was fascinated by this, and he read some critical comments in a French newspaper and said, this doesn't seem right. He said, my gut feeling tells me that free trade is a good thing, and here is all this criticism of Cobden and the free trade movement in the French newspapers. I'm going to order some of these English newspapers and read it for myself, which he did. And then he discovered Richard Cobden and the Anti-Corn Law League, which was the name of his free trade movement. And Bastiat is fascinated by this. He sees that so many of the problems that he sees around him in southwestern France is the result of various government interventions, of tariffs, both stemming from the Napoleonic period, but also when the monarchy was restored after 1815. Economic regulation and controls were reimposed as well as part of the restoration. And he sees this as all being, it's causing all sorts of economic hardships for his region. So he decides he's going to create his own French free trade movement based upon that of Richard Cobden. And so he writes an essay. This is where we enter the period of his life which is called the scene. When Bastiat suddenly breaks onto the French stage with a number of brilliant essays which he writes for the main free market journal of the day, the Journal des Économistes. He writes on the influence of the French and English tariffs. Suddenly he shows himself to have read widely in the literature and to be fully aware of the economic issues facing France, and someone who has new and original and interesting ideas about how these problems might be solved by turning towards the free market. So he is invited to Paris, and this begins a very short but intense period of activity, where Bastiat becomes involved in French free trade circles, goes to Paris, meets the political economists and free traders who were grouped around the Journal des Économistes and the Society of Political Economists, and they discover in Bastiat a fellow traveller and also an original thinker. But one of the curious things about Bastiat going to Paris is that he's still very much a provincial gentleman. He speaks with a funny provincial accent. He wears provincial clothes. And when he goes to Paris and joins in the very high social circles of these French Parisian political economists and activists, they look down upon him and they mock his provincial accent and his provincial clothing. But Bastiat picks away at this prejudice and eventually proves through his writing that he is a man of substance and of great significance. And gradually he is welcomed socially as well as intellectually to the world of the free market economists in Paris. When his free trade movement is unsuccessful politically in the mid-1840s, the French are not yet ready to dismantle their tariff barriers because they see the English as the great threat, and they believe that any kind of reduction in tariffs will allow or provide an economic opportunity to the British, which they don't want to allow. And this movement is gradually defeated, and this turns Bastiat into another direction, which is that of an economic journalist. Bastiat decides that the only way to overcome the problems which defeated his free trade movement was to attack and demolish and refute all the economic prejudices that French people had about the free market. And this is when he begins a campaign of writing what he called his economic sophisms. Sophisms in his mind were fallacies. These were the misconceptions, misunderstandings, and bad theory that people held about how the free market worked. And his plan was to develop an entire series of essays which would debunk all these sophisms and fallacies. And he began writing. He wrote dozens and dozens of these wonderful stories, these wonderful fables, these journalistic articles, and he used a combination of great humor and deep insight to make fun of some of the absurdities of protectionist thought. And this ended up in the production of 2 volumes of sophisms, Economic Sophisms Part 1 and Part 2, which you can get in the fee edition, and also other sophisms which have never been published in English and translated into English, and which Liberty Fund will be providing in the near future. So he turns away from this single issue political movement that he first becomes involved in, the free trade movement, turns to economic journalism to try and refute some of these deeply ingrained economic prejudices against free trade. And then he comes across another problem, and that is that during the 1840s, socialism in France was beginning to take off in a big way. It had begun in the late 1820s and developed in the 1830s, but by the mid-1840s it was becoming a more and more powerful force. So by the time the 1848 revolution broke out, there was a significant socialist political grouping and constituency which would give them a platform for the introduction of socialist policies during the 1840 revolution. So Bastiat decides that the next area that needed debunking or attacking was the socialist movement. So in the late 1840s, he turns his pen towards debunking many of these socialist writers like Proudhon, for example, whom I mentioned earlier. In 1848, in February, the revolution breaks out in Paris, and the monarchy is overthrown. And an entirely new political system is in the offing. Bastiat gets elected from his southwestern province, Les Landes, to the Constituent Assembly. This is in the first month of the revolution. So he goes to Paris and he becomes deeply, deeply involved in revolutionary politics. And he's elected a second time when the new constitution is written and the National Assembly is appointed. And he is elected again the second time to this new assembly. And he's not just someone who sits on the backbenches. He becomes extremely active in a very powerful political committee, the Finance Committee, which overlooks government expenditure. And Bastiat, through this committee, is able to put the free market limited government case for balanced budgets, minimal government expenditure, opposition to some of the crazier socialist ideas about government provision of various welfare services, like the national workshops. This was a system of government relief for the unemployed, which virtually drove the French government to bankruptcy. So Bastiat is deeply involved in the economics and politics of the revolutionary period. He continues to write his journalistic articles, as well as give speeches, as well as serve on this important committee. While all this is going along, he is suffering a terrible, terrible disease which ultimately kills him far too young in 1850 at the age of 49. He has a throat condition which continues to get worse. Scholars have argued whether this is tuberculosis, which is something that killed his parents when he was 8 or 9 years old. But I think from reading some of his letters and some of the descriptions of his increasingly bad condition, that it might have been something like throat cancer. It's hard to tell because the diagnosis of those days was rather primitive. Anyway, whatever it was, he was in extraordinary pain, and this hampered his journalistic activity, it hampered his activities as a member of parliament, and also made it difficult for him to write his magnum opus. While all this is going on, he wants to write a major theoretical treatise of economics, which he calls Economic Harmonies. And he dies before he is able to complete this work. Less than half of it is fully finished. And some of his colleagues and friends put together a volume of his incompleted chapters to try and produce something similar or something close to what he intended before he died. So this is one of the great tragedies of Frederic Bastiat, that he was so busy, so active, so interested in what was going on around him, but this terrible throat condition pulled him down before he'd finished. So that gives you a sort of summary of his main activities as a provincial lawyer, magistrate, his activities as a Parisian political activist and journalist and active theorist in the free market and political economy circles in Paris. This next slide shows you some of the major works that Bastiat wrote during his life. What he's most famous for, I think, in English is the essays, the many, many important essays that he wrote during 1848 and 49. Property and Law, Justice and Fraternity, Property and Plunder, and his great essay, The State. Now the state, that's the last item on the list there on this slide. I should say something about the state, because when the revolution broke out in February of 1848, one of Bastiat's younger colleagues, Gustave de Molinari, came running around to Bastiat's house and said, we've got to do something. We're in the middle of a revolution. Socialists are trying to agitate and organize the people on the street. We have to do some counter-organization. So let's have our own little newspaper that we can hand out on street corners. And so Molinari and his friend Coquelin, Charles Coquelin, went to see Bastiat with his proposal. Bastiat said, great, this is fantastic. We need just that kind of magazine. But he said, I believe in the law, and we can't break the law. So we have to do it legally. Now the French censorship situation in 1848 was that of prior censorship. Before you could publish something like a newspaper, you had to have it agreed to or approved prior to publication by someone in government offices downtown. And so what Molinari and Coquelin had done was they had written the content of the first issue, had shown it to Bastiat. Bastiat said, this is great. Let's go to the Hotel de Ville and get an official to approve this, and then we can have it published. Of course, this was in the beginning of the revolution, and the Hotel de Ville, this was the main sort of offices of the government, was completely in chaos. There were people running up and down the stairs with guns and swords, and they were looting offices, and it was just absolute chaos. And Bastiat said to his younger colleagues, he said, I think the government is otherwise preoccupied. Let's go ahead with publishing this little newspaper. So they agreed, and they ran off to try and find a publisher, a printer. As they were going through the streets of Paris, the revolution was underway, and they came across some other group of people handing out a newspaper with the very name that they had chosen for their newspaper. It was called La République. And so they said, oh my goodness, we can't publish ours under the same name. What do we call it? So they decided on La République Française, the French Republic. They found a print shop, but it was completely empty because the printers had all run off to join the revolution. They eventually found a second print shop, but the printers refused to print their newspaper because it was reactionary, it was right-wing, it was pro-free market, and they wouldn't have anything to do with it. They eventually found a third printer who was willing to print their small newspaper, and that's how it hit the streets in the first few days of the revolution in 1848. And it was in this small newspaper that the first draft, the first version of what would become this more polished essay called The State, it appeared in early 1848. And so that is the origin of this essay. It wasn't just a theoretical piece, but it came out of the fury and the upheaval of the revolution that was taking place in the streets of Paris. Let me go to my next slide here. These are some more of the essays that Bastiat wrote in these revolutionary years of 1848-49. Protectionism and communism, capitalism and rent, peace and liberty, damn money, and then he began to publish the first part of his Economic Harmonies in 1850. One of the last things that he wrote in 1850 was this famous essay that I've already mentioned, What is Seen and What is Not Seen, which I think pays some considered thought and reading, and that's one that I would strongly recommend that you have a look at if you're interested in pursuing this further. I've put together a collection of some of the key quotations from Bastiat's writings, and this is a summary of them here. You can find the handout in a PDF format on my webpage, and I strongly recommend that you have a look at this. I won't have time to go through all of this, but let me draw your attention to number 2, restrictions on trade that harm consumers. This is his famous Petition of the Candle Makers from Economic Sophisms, Part 1. And here's the slide that goes with that. There's one paragraph from this very, very funny and clever article, and it gives you a good sense of the sorts of the style that Bastiat used and why he was such a clever and persuasive journalist. One of the things he was particularly good at was withering satire and humour. And this one shows how he does this by taking the reductio ad absurdum argument. If you take the argument of your opponent and assume that it's true, but push it to its furthest and ultimate conclusion and reach something that is absolutely absurd, then you're halfway to refuting that person's argument. And so here he writes in this very funny and amusing way. And remember, this is designed for an audience of people who are not skilled in economics, so just ordinary readers, working class people, middle class people. And here is a petition. It's called A Petition from the Manufacturers of Candles, Tapers, Lanterns, Candlesticks, Street Lamps, Snuffers, Extinguishers, and from the producers of tallow, oil, resin, alcohol, etc., 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 to the honourable members of the Chambers of Deputies. Gentlemen, you are on the right track. You reject abstract theories of free trade and have little regard for abundance and low prices. You concern yourselves mainly with the fate of the producer. You wish to free him from foreign competition, that is, to reserve the domestic market for domestic industry. So they go on to explain in greater detail why they deserve this special treatment from the Chamber of Deputies, because they too are a domestic industry, producers of candles, tapers and lanterns and so on. And this is where he pushes home this reductio ad absurdum argument. He says, we ask you to be so good as to pass a law requiring the closing of all windows, dormers, skylights, inside and outside shutters, curtains, casements, bullseyes, deadlights and blinds. In short, all openings, holes, chinks and fissures through which the light of the sun is wont to enter houses, to the detriment of the fair industries from which we are proud to say we have endowed the country, a country that cannot, without betraying ingratitude, abandon us today to so unequal a combat. So they're asking the Chamber of Deputies to protect their domestic industry from sunshine. And of course what he's arguing is that the same absurd argument applies to any industry that asks for protection and from government special treatment, as opposed to the cheaper importations of foreign products like British clothing or other manufactured goods. So this is Frederic Bastiat's very amusing style and one of his wittiest and cleverest of his economic sophisms. Now there are many others that I would strongly recommend that you look at. I've given you a list here, and I don't have time tonight to go through them in any detail. But I will draw my remarks to a close by talking about one of his most famous essays called The State. And he wanted to provide a definition of the state, and this is one I think that sticks in a lot of people's minds as being both clever and also very true. He talks about the state is something that people turn to get special treatment, whether it's from what they regard as unfair competition or from hardship of various kinds like unemployment, or because they have close friends and contacts in the government who can provide them with benefits. Bastiat asks, of course, what would happen if every single person, every single group within the community turned to the state in this fashion? He says, this provides his definition. The state is the great fiction by which everyone endeavours to live at the expense of everyone else. And he goes into some detail to explain how this is impossible, that there always has to be a small group of people who benefit at the expense of everyone else. If everyone was to seek and get equal privilege and protection from the state, there would be no benefits to be had, because the benefits would be so distributed and watered down that they would perhaps have no benefit or use to anyone in particular. So this is one of the very interesting conclusions that Frederic Bastiat comes to. This is Bastiat's tombstone. He died in Rome. He was sent there by his doctor for a better climate than Paris provided at the beginning of winter. And he tragically died in Rome on Christmas Eve, December 1850. And this was the tombstone that was erected for him. And then this is the monument that was erected by some of his supporters in 1878. So I've tried to give you an overview of the life and work of Frederic Bastiat. There's a great deal more that one could say, but I think I've given you some kind of taste of his writings. The things that you can find to go deeper in this, if you go to my webpage, you can also see that there is material at the Online Library of Liberty. This is the main page of that. There is various quotations about liberty, including quotations by Bastiat. And then there is the Frederic Bastiat page, which lists the works that we currently have online by Frederic Bastiat. So that should provide you with some further reading if you're interested. So what I'll do is I'll leave it there and open it up for any questions that you might have, and I'm more than willing to answer questions. And I invite you also to think about writing some limericks about Bastiat to contribute, add to my small collection. So Irina, are you ready to take over? Alexander?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hart. Sorry about that. I had some audio difficulties on my end.
Okay.
To our attendees out there, do we have any questions for Dr. Hart? We've got about 10 more minutes to take Q&A. Okay, well, it doesn't look like anything's popping up immediately. Dr. Hart, oh, wait, I think we do have one. Stand by. This question is from Chris Derry. It says, George Roche, R-O-C-H-E, wrote a history book on Bastiat. How rigorous do you think that book is?
Oh, I've used that myself. I think it's a very good introduction, and I would say that's a very good starting point. What we have been able to do with our edition of translations of Bastiat's work is to go into a fair bit more detail. One of my tasks, for example, is to look at every single person, every single essay and book Bastiat referred to and try and track it down and to find out more about it. So we have provided a huge amount of footnotes and glossary entries in our edition that should expand upon the very good work that Roche did all those years ago.
Excellent, excellent. Are there any other questions out there for Dr. Hart? Okay, well, if you think of any, feel free to email info@studentsforliberty.com or .org or Dr. Hart himself, and I'm sure he'd be glad to answer those questions.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Hart, and all the participants this evening. I hope you all can continue coming back to our webinars to learn more throughout the year. Our next webinar is next Monday, November 8th. Dr. John Hasness is joining us to discuss failure of the market failure argument. You can find out how to register by visiting our website, studentsforliberty.org. On a final note, shortly you will be emailed a follow-up survey to the webinar. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. It helps us know how to improve our programs and make these webinars more interesting to you. In the follow-up, you'll also see a collection of links to all the information you saw in tonight's webinar with Dr. Hart. The webinar will also be archived and posted on our website probably in mid-November when we get done with the conferences. And with that, I think we're all wrapped up. Thank you again, everyone, for spending some time with us this evening.
Well, thank you. Good night.
Good night.